The dojo was alive with the hum of eager students, the sharp sound of footsteps hitting the mat, and the clanging of hands against pads. Young faces, full of ambition and energy, filled the space, their eyes focused on their instructors as they practiced their moves. Among the sea of youthful bodies stood one quiet figure, Grandma May, a black grandmother who, at first glance, appeared out of place. Dressed in a soft pink gi, her hair wrapped neatly in a headscarf, she was far older than any of the students. Her wrinkles spoke of wisdom, her posture spoke of years of life lived with dignity, yet her presence was almost like an afterthought to the younger crowd. The students, mostly in their teens and early 20s, exchanged glances, snickering under their breath. Some of the braver ones even openly mocked her, dismissing her age and appearance as signs of weakness. "What's she doing here?" one of them whispered. "Isn't she too old for this?" Another student, a cocky young kid named Tom, couldn't resist taunting her out loud. "You sure you're ready for this, Grandma? Think you can handle a real challenge?" His words dripped with disdain, his smirk a direct challenge to the frail-looking woman who simply stood quietly at the edge of the mat, watching the commotion unfold. May didn't flinch. She didn't respond with words or irritation. She simply observed, her calm demeanor unwavering as the laughter and taunts grew louder. The room filled with the air of arrogance, young minds certain of their own invincibility, filled with the naivete that age or appearance could determine strength. But Grandma May, wise beyond her years, knew something that no one else in the room understood. As Tom continued to mock her, and the other students egged him on, she waited patiently for the moment when his arrogance would reach its peak. She knew that strength wasn't about how loud you could be or how much you could prove to others. It was about knowing your own power, waiting for the right time, and acting with precision. The room quieted when the instructor called for a new drill, but Tom was not done with his bravado. He strode confidently toward May, a mocking grin still plastered on his face. "Come on, Grandma, show me what you've got." "Bet you can't even lift me," he challenged, stepping onto the mat with an exaggerated, theatrical gesture, clearly expecting to be met with the same fear or hesitation most people would have when confronted by a younger, stronger opponent. The other students gathered at the edges of the mat, eager to see the inevitable defeat they believed would occur. May didn't move. Her eyes, steady and calm, never left his. She took a breath, letting the noise of the dojo fade away. The world around her seemed to slow as she focused, her body already instinctively flowing into the familiar patterns of years of practice. She had seen her share of ridicule, of doubt, and of dismissiveness, but she had learned long ago that her worth was not determined by others' opinions. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone. When the moment came, she moved with the grace and speed of someone who had mastered not just the physical but the mental aspects of martial arts. In one swift motion, May stepped to the side, avoiding Tom's rush. The surprise on his face lasted only a moment before she seized the opportunity. With a simple shift of her weight and the flick of her wrist, she sent Tom flying through the air, his body landing effortlessly across the mat with a heavy thud. The dojo fell into a stunned silence. Tom, lying on the floor, stared up at her in shock, his cocky grin completely gone. The students who had been laughing just moments before were now wide-eyed, frozen in disbelief. Not a word was spoken for what seemed like an eternity. May, standing over him with the same composed calm she'd maintained throughout the entire encounter, didn't gloat or say a word. She simply offered a hand to Tom, her voice steady and kind when she spoke. "You learn more from patience than from arrogance," she said softly, helping him to his feet. There was no need for further explanation. Her actions had spoken louder than any words ever could. The room, still silent, began to stir as the students processed what had just happened. The respect that May had earned in that moment wasn't loud or boisterous. It didn't come from a flashy display of strength or force. It came from the quiet, unwavering certainty that true power lies not in the surface level, but in the inner strength that carries you through the toughest moments. For the first time, the students looked at May not as an old woman in a pink GI, but as someone whose quiet strength had commanded respect. They understood now that strength doesn't come with a label. It's not bound by age, appearance, or preconceived notions. It's a force that emanates from within, often in the most unexpected forms. As Tom walked off the mat, his shoulders slumped and his head down, the students around him whispered among themselves, a newfound admiration in their voices. The lesson they just learned about patience, humility, and strength would stay with them for a long time. And May, standing at the edge of the mat, simply smiled to herself. Her quiet victory had done more than silence a young man. It had reminded everyone in that room that strength isn't always visible at first glance. It's earned in moments of calm, in patience, and in quiet power that doesn't need to announce itself. It simply is. The dojo was alive with the energy of youth, the sharp sound of feet striking mats and the grunts of ambitious students pushing themselves to the limit. Most of them were young, fueled by the fire of competition and a desire to prove themselves. In the center of the room, the instructor barked out commands, urging them to push harder, move faster, and train longer. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, determination, and youthful pride. Then, the door opened. A figure entered, slow but steady, her presence immediately noticeable. She was older than anyone in the room, a black grandmother in her late 60s, wearing a bright pink GI that caught the eye of every student present. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she stood with a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from her despite the obvious contrast with the others. The younger students, most of them in their 20s and 30s, stopped their training and turned to look at her. Whispers filled the air, followed by laughter. They didn't know who she was or why she was there, but to them, the sight of an elderly woman in a vibrant GI was laughable. They didn't expect her to be anything more than a grandmother, someone who had no business in a dojo, let alone on the mat. "Hey, Grandma, you lost," one of the cockier young men in a white GI called out, a smirk on his face as he stood with his arms crossed. "This is a place for fighters, not grandmas." His words were laced with mockery, his tone dripping with arrogance. He and the other students snickered, some even taking out their phones to record the spectacle. The woman, unfazed, simply smiled. She didn't speak, didn't retaliate with harsh words or defensive gestures. She walked to the edge of the mat, her steps deliberate, calm, and collected. Then, she turned to face the young man. He stepped forward, clearly eager to make a point and show everyone that he was the dominant one in the room. "You really think you can keep up with me, old lady?" he taunted. "Come on, let's see what you've got." The students' laughter grew louder as they gathered in a circle around the mat, ready for the spectacle of the grandmother's humiliation. The woman remained silent, her eyes sharp as she studied the young man's movements. She took a deep breath, ready for whatever was about to come. The boy lunged forward with all the youthful energy and speed he could muster, aiming to take her down with a swift, overconfident strike. He expected her to flinch, to back away in fear. What he didn't expect was the stillness in her eyes, the calmness in her stance, and the quiet wisdom in her movements. As he swung at her, she sidestepped effortlessly, moving with the grace of someone who had long ago learned the value of patience and control. The boy stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him past her, and in that split second, she seized the opportunity. With a swift motion, she gripped his wrist, twisted his arm, and using his own momentum, threw him effortlessly across the mat. The dojo fell silent. The boy landed with a thud, stunned and disoriented, his pride shattered in an instant. He scrambled to get up, his face flushed with embarrassment, as the other students looked on in disbelief. The grandmother remained standing, her posture still relaxed and composed, her face free of any smugness. She hadn't needed to say a word. Her action had done all the talking for her. The young man, now on his knees, looked up at her with wide eyes, his arrogance replaced by shock and confusion. "How did you," he began, his voice faltering. "How did you do that?" She looked down at him, her eyes warm but firm, as though she were speaking to a child who had just learned an important lesson. "It's not about strength, boy," she said, her voice calm but clear. "It's about knowing when to move, when to wait, and when to use your opponent's weakness against them. It's about experience, and patience." The crowd stood in stunned silence, processing what they had just witnessed. The young man, still reeling from the fall, slowly stood up, his face now a mixture of respect and humility. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging that he had underestimated her, and more importantly, he had underestimated the power of calm strength and wisdom. One by one, the other students began to lower their phones, their laughter turning into thoughtful silence. They had come into the dojo thinking they were the ones who had the strength, the speed, and the power. But what they learned in that moment was that there were different kinds of power, kinds that weren't visible in the rush of youthful energy. It wasn't about who was the fastest, the strongest, or the youngest. It was about experience, about knowing yourself and your opponent, about control and grace. As the grandmother stepped off the mat, her back straight and her eyes forward, the students began to gather around her, not with mockery, but with genuine respect. They understood, now, that she wasn't just a grandmother in a pink gi. She was a champion in her own right. The lesson had been clear: the loudest victories aren't always the ones that come with a display of strength. Sometimes, the greatest victories are the quiet ones, the ones that come with wisdom, patience, and the humility to know that respect is earned, not assumed. The boy in the white gi bowed deeply, acknowledging not just her skill, but the depth of character she had demonstrated. In that moment, the dojo had transformed. The students had learned that true strength comes from within, and sometimes, it's the unexpected champions who teach us the most. The dojo was alive with energy that afternoon, filled with the sound of practiced strikes and the rhythmic slap of feet against the mat. Sensei Nakamura, a seasoned martial artist with decades of experience, watched over his students as they sparred, his face a mask of calm concentration. The young fighters, most no older than 15, were brimming with enthusiasm, perhaps a little too much for their own good. Their arrogance was palpable, their swagger growing with each successful move. In the corner of the room, a figure in a bright pink gi entered, her presence immediately disrupting the energy. She was an older woman, silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her movements deliberate and steady. Grandma Ethel, as she was affectionately known by the regulars, had been a student of Sensei Nakamura for longer than any of the young students had been alive. But to them, she was just a quirky old woman in a garish outfit. The younger students couldn't help but snicker as they saw her enter, their laughter bubbling over. "Look at this," one boy whispered loudly to his friends, eyeing the bright pink gi. "What is she doing here? The retirement home let her out for a day trip." His friends chuckled along, but their attention never wavered from the new arrival. Ethel, however, remained unfazed. She calmly made her way to the changing room, moving with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting their craft. She was a fixture in the dojo, always there, quiet, unassuming, but always present. As the session began, one of the boys, Kyle, a tall, broad-shouldered teenager with an ego to match, smirked and walked over to the instructor. "Hey, sensei," he called out loudly, drawing attention. "I bet I could show that grandma a thing or two. Maybe I can teach her some real moves." The class laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that echoed with the arrogance of youth, the kind that didn't know enough to realize how foolish it sounded. Kyle was a natural athlete, fast, strong, and confident in his abilities. He thought that, with his physical prowess, he could easily take on anyone, even an old woman in a pink gi. Sensei Nakamura, who had seen the show of bravado before, didn't respond at first. He simply nodded, his calm demeanor never changing. "Kyle," he said, his voice low but clear, "if you wish to challenge Grandma Ethel, then step forward. But remember, this is not a joke." Kyle, his arrogance swelling, strutted onto the mat, already imagining how easily he would toss the elderly woman aside. The students gathered around the edges of the mat, eager to witness what they thought would be a hilarious spectacle. Ethel, standing across from him, smiled softly. There was no trace of hesitation in her. She raised her hands in the traditional stance, the faintest of chuckles escaping her lips as she settled into position. Her eyes never left Kyle's. "Ready when you are, young man," she said, her voice warm but firm. The taunting boy squared off, bouncing lightly on his feet. "All right, Grandma," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let's see what you've got." With a sudden burst of energy, Kyle lunged forward, aiming to grab Ethel and toss her aside in one swift move. His strong arms reached for her shoulders, but in the blink of an eye, Ethel sidestepped with the agility of someone half her age. Kyle's momentum carried him forward, his arms sweeping through empty air. Before he could react, Ethel's hands moved with expert precision. She grabbed his arm and, with a fluid motion, twisted it behind his back while simultaneously using his own weight against him. Kyle's feet left the mat as Ethel pivoted and, in a perfect demonstration of technique, threw him effortlessly across the mat. The impact was swift, the loud thud of his body hitting the mat making the students jump. There was a collective gasp from the onlookers. Kyle lay there for a moment, stunned and disoriented, before slowly sitting up, his face red with both embarrassment and pain. He looked up at Ethel, his breath heavy, but the cocky grin he'd had earlier had vanished. Ethel stood calmly across from him, her posture still graceful, her hands resting loosely at her sides. She didn't gloat. She didn't even speak. The power she'd demonstrated in that single move was enough to silence the room. Kyle finally stood, his arrogance deflated. He wiped the dust off his gi and, to his credit, walked over to Ethel, extending his hand. I wasn't expecting that," he admitted, his voice sheepish. Ethel shook his hand, her grip firm yet gentle. "No one ever does, dear." The room was silent for a moment, the students now looking at Ethel with a newfound respect. The playful mocking and laughter had turned into an almost reverent silence. Kyle, who had been the embodiment of youthful arrogance just minutes before, now stood before her in awe, the lesson he had just learned written clearly across his face. Sensei Nakamura finally spoke, breaking the silence. "Kyle," he said, his voice warm yet serious, "you learned today what many do not until much later in life, that true strength does not come from arrogance or physical power alone. It comes from humility, control, and understanding. The students, who had once dismissed Ethel as nothing more than an eccentric old lady, now understood the depth of her quiet strength. There was a certain power in being unassuming, in letting one's actions speak louder than words or posturing. Ethel, with a smile, turned to the class and addressed them, her voice as calm and composed as ever. Martial arts is not about showing off. It's about learning control of your body, your mind, and your ego. Never forget that the most powerful warriors are often the ones who choose not to fight, who choose instead to teach. The students nodded, their eyes wide, taking in the truth of her words. They had learned their lesson. Humility and control were far more powerful than arrogance and bravado. And Kyle, his chest still heaving, stood a little taller, not from pride, but from the quiet, profound realization that true strength was not something to flaunt, but something to wield with grace and humility. The dojo buzzed with energy, the air thick with the sound of feet slapping against mats, punches landing, and the grunts of students pushing themselves harder with every strike. A group of younger students, mostly in their teens, had gathered for their afternoon training, eager to show off their skills and test each other's limits. The instructor, watching from the sidelines, occasionally chimed in with corrections, but for the most part, the students were left to spar and practice amongst themselves. Then, the door creaked open, and in walked an unexpected figure. A grandmother, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, stepped into the dojo dressed in a bright pink gi. Her presence was immediately met with quiet chuckles and curious glances from the students. Their laughter was barely concealed behind their hands, some whispering to each other in disbelief. What was a woman of her age doing here? This was a place for serious training, not for grandmothers in pink. Among the group, one young boy, an arrogant and self-assured teenager named Tyler, laughed the loudest. He had been training for years, and his confidence had begun to border on cocky. With a smirk plastered across his face, he looked her up and down, then turned to his friends, nudging one of them with his elbow. "I think she's lost," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe she's here to see her grandson or something." Without missing a beat, Tyler turned to the grandmother and, with a swagger, called out, "Hey, Grandma, you look like you've got some moves. How about a spar? I'll go easy on you." The other students watched, expecting the grandmother to back down, maybe laugh nervously or refuse. After all, she was old, at least 60, maybe 70, and there was no way she could be a serious threat to a young, fit athlete like Tyler. But to their surprise, the grandmother didn't flinch. She simply smiled, a glint of something mischievous in her eyes. "Young man," she said, her voice calm and steady, "I may be old, but I've learned that true strength comes from within. I'd be happy to spar with you." The room fell silent as the students waited for what would happen next. Tyler, feeling confident in his youth and speed, assumed the challenge would be a walk in the park. He took off his jacket, tossed it aside, and approached her with a cocky grin. "Prepare to be surprised, Grandma," he said, barely able to keep the smugness out of his voice. They faced off in the center of the mat, and the other students leaned in, eager to see this older woman be put in her place. Tyler bounced lightly on his feet, his fists up, ready to strike. The grandmother, however, stood still. She didn't adopt a defensive stance or seem overly concerned. She simply remained calm, her hands loosely at her sides, her posture relaxed but grounded. "Ready?" Tyler taunted, looking for any sign of hesitation. "Whenever you are," she replied, her tone unbothered. The moment Tyler lunged forward, aiming a quick jab at her torso, The room held its breath. In the blink of an eye, the grandmother moved with astonishing speed and precision. She stepped to the side, effortlessly evading the punch, and before Tyler even realized what was happening, she gripped his arm, twisted his body with a fluid motion, and, using his own momentum against him, flipped him across the mat with one clean, controlled move. The thud of his body hitting the mat echoed through the room. For a moment, there was complete silence. The students, wide-eyed and slack-jawed, stared at the grandmother, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Tyler lay there, stunned and disoriented, unable to process how someone so much older had taken him down so easily. He scrambled to get back on his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment, but the grandmother didn't move. She simply stood there, watching him calmly, her hands folded in front of her. Tyler finally got to his feet, his bravado shattered. "What the?" he started, but he didn't finish his sentence. He didn't need to. His cocky attitude had crumbled in an instant. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his youth and strength alone didn't guarantee victory. The other students, once snickering and dismissive, now looked at the grandmother with a mix of awe and respect. The instructor, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, nodded approvingly. This was the lesson he'd been hoping his students would learn: strength wasn't just about size or age. True power came from experience, from the years of practice and wisdom that couldn't be measured by superficial traits. Tyler stood there, slightly winded, his arrogance replaced by humility. He didn't know what to say. But the grandmother, sensing his discomfort, smiled warmly at him. "You've got potential, young man," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But remember, it's not about how hard you hit. It's about knowing when to move, when to listen, and when to learn." The room was still for a moment before the students began to murmur among themselves. The cocky bravado that had filled the dojo just moments before was replaced by a deep sense of humility. The grandmother had not only humbled Tyler but had taught them all a lesson in respect. With a final glance at the stunned students, the grandmother bowed slightly and began to leave the mat. "Remember," she said, "never judge a book by its cover. And always respect your elders. You never know who's walking beside you." As she left, the students stood in quiet reverence, their eyes filled with newfound respect. Tyler, still trying to shake off his shock, walked to the edge of the mat, his head down. The lesson had been crystal clear. Strength and respect weren't determined by age or appearance. True power was found in skill, humility, and experience. And for the first time, Tyler understood that wisdom couldn't be measured in years. It could only be earned. The dojo buzzed with the energy of young, eager students, all dressed in their clean, crisp gis, ready to prove themselves. They were focused, determined, their eyes gleaming with ambition as they practiced their throws and strikes under the watchful eye of their instructor. Among them, there was one student who stood out not for his skills, but for his arrogance. Malik, a boy who had been training for years and was considered one of the dojo's top performers, stood tall, his chest puffed out with pride. He was quick to judge, quick to belittle, and always eager to prove himself superior to anyone who dared challenge him. On this particular day, as the students lined up to begin their drills, a quiet presence entered the dojo: a grandmother, in a pink gi. She was older than any of the students, and her movements, while deliberate, had a certain grace about them. Her face was warm and welcoming, a quiet smile playing at the corners of her lips as she gently adjusted her belt. To the young students, especially Malik, she was nothing more than a figure of amusement. The moment she stepped onto the mat, a few of the boys snickered, but it was Malik who couldn't hide his laughter. "What is this, some kind of joke?" he sneered aloud, drawing the attention of the others. "This is a dojo, not a retirement home." He looked at her with condescension, his tone dripping with mockery. "What do you think you're going to do here, Grandma? You don't belong on the mat. Go back to your knitting." The laughter from the others was half-hearted, but it still stung. Malik had that effect on people. He was the loudest, the fastest, and the one everyone else admired, but it was a kind of admiration built on fear and insecurity. The grandmother, however, didn't flinch. She stood still for a moment, her eyes meeting Malik's with a quiet intensity that made him pause. She didn't respond with words, there was no need for them. Her presence was enough. "Are you challenging me, young man?" she asked, her voice calm, yet firm. Her question wasn't laced with anger, but rather with a knowing that came from years of experience. Malik, never one to back down, grinned and stepped forward with a swagger. "Yeah, I'll show you what this is all about," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Get ready to be put in your place." The other students, sensing something might be about to unfold, gathered around the edge of the mat, eager to witness the showdown between the old woman and their arrogant peer. Malik was ready to prove that this grandmother, who looked more like a sweet old lady than a fighter, didn't stand a chance against him. The grandmother, on the other hand, simply lowered herself into a stance, moving with a fluidity that was both effortless and precise. She wasn't in a rush. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just centered herself, waiting for the right moment. Malik lunged at her, his movements quick, but lacking the finesse that true skill demanded. He attempted a forceful throw, thinking his speed and strength would be enough to overpower her. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. The grandmother sidestepped with a subtle grace, her hand moving to Malik's shoulder. Without any forceful gesture, she turned her body, using his momentum against him. In one smooth motion, she threw him across the mat effortlessly. The room went silent. Malik lay there for a moment, stunned, his face flushed with embarrassment. His pride had been shattered in an instant, and the sheer simplicity with which the grandmother had thrown him left him breathless. He had expected her to be slow, clumsy, and easy to beat. Instead, he had been humbled by someone who had none of the traits he had so arrogantly assumed were essential for strength. The other students, who had been snickering moments ago, were now completely silent. They exchanged looks of disbelief, their eyes wide with shock. They had all expected the grandmother to be an easy target, someone they could laugh at, someone who didn't belong. But the lesson they were learning in that moment was much deeper than any technique they could practice in class. Malik, still lying on the mat, slowly got up, his pride wounded but his respect growing. The grandmother didn't offer a hand to help him rise, she simply stood there, waiting for him to regain his composure. Her demeanor remained calm, steady, and unwavering. After a moment, Malik stood up, dusting himself off. The words he had once been so eager to speak were gone. Instead, he simply nodded at her, his expression now one of quiet humility. I didn't expect that," he muttered, his arrogance replaced with an unfamiliar respect. The grandmother smiled gently, but it wasn't a smile of triumph, it was a smile of understanding. "Strength isn't just about speed or power," she said softly, her voice steady and kind. "True strength comes from within. It comes from patience, wisdom, and the ability to remain grounded when others expect you to falter. You don't need to prove anything to anyone, Malik. Let your actions speak for you." The students, still processing what had just happened, looked at each other, the lesson settling deep within them. The grandmother, in her pink gi, had become a symbol of the hidden strength that often goes unnoticed. She had shown them all that power doesn't come from how you look, how old you are, or how loud you can shout. True strength comes from the quiet confidence that resides in the heart, from the wisdom gained through years of life, and from the humility to know that no one is ever truly beneath you. In that moment, the dojo had been transformed not by the loudest or most aggressive fighter, but by the one who had the strength to remain calm, to teach through example, and to show that every person, regardless of age or appearance, has a power that deserves respect. And from that day forward, the students no longer underestimated the grandmother. They saw her not just as a sweet old lady, but as a master of martial arts, a woman who had earned her place on the mat not through boasting or arrogance, but through quiet dignity, wisdom, and the power of her unshakable spirit. The dojo buzzed with energy as a group of young students practiced their punches and kicks, their movements quick and sharp under the guidance of Sensei Nakamura. The students, mostly teenagers, were filled with a mix of ambition and cocky confidence, eager to prove themselves to each other and to the world. They were skilled, fast, and hungry for respect, their youth and strength fueling their arrogance. As the doors to the dojo creaked open, a hush fell over the room. In walked a figure unlike any of them had ever seen, a black woman, around 60, with graying hair tied into a neat bun, and dressed in a vibrant pink gi that contrasted sharply with the traditional white gis of the students around her. The room fell silent for a moment, and then a ripple of laughter spread through the students, some snickering behind their hands, others outright giggling. It wasn't the woman herself that caused the reaction, it was the idea of her, the concept of someone so seemingly out of place in a dojo full of young, strong fighters. A grandmother, in a pink gi, walking into their space, it just didn't fit the image they had of a martial artist. The laughter grew louder, but she stood still in the doorway, a calm, serene expression on her face, as though she had heard it all before. She wasn't fazed by the mocking glances or the whispered jokes, her presence was unwavering, as steady as the calm before a storm. The loudest of the students, a teenager named Ethan, who had been among the most dismissive of her appearance, stepped forward. His smirk was evident as he cracked his knuckles, sizing her up. "You lost, Grandma," he taunted, his voice dripping with arrogance. "I think you're in the wrong place. This is a dojo for real fighters, not, whatever you're supposed to be." His words were sharp, his gaze filled with condescension. The other students snickered again, egging him on. It was clear they expected nothing more than a joke, perhaps a brief scuffle for amusement, and then they'd return to their training, their sense of superiority intact. But the woman didn't flinch. She simply looked at Ethan with a calmness that made him hesitate for just a moment. The room grew quieter, sensing the shift. Ethan scoffed, dismissing any notion of hesitation, and arrogantly assumed a fighting stance. "All right, let's see what you've got, Grandma." He beckoned her with a taunting wave of his hand, still convinced that her age and appearance would make her an easy target. The students leaned forward, eager to watch what they believed would be a laughable confrontation. But the woman whose name was Miss Evelyn did not rush to engage. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step onto the mat, her movements measured and calm. Her eyes locked with Ethan's, her expression serene, as if she were not facing a challenge but merely an opportunity. She bowed respectfully to him, as was customary in martial arts, before standing tall again, her body radiating quiet confidence. There was no boastful speech, no grandstanding, just a presence that exuded an almost magnetic calm. And then, in the blink of an eye, it happened. Ethan, with his youthful arrogance, charged forward, launching a quick series of strikes meant to overwhelm her. His speed was impressive, his punches and kicks executed with precision. He was faster than most of the other students in the room, but Miss Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply stepped aside with a fluidity that seemed effortless, her movements as natural as breathing. In one swift, almost graceful motion, she extended her leg, tripping Ethan and sending him sprawling across the mat with a thundering crash. The room went completely still. Ethan lay there, stunned, for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. He had expected a fight, a struggle, something that would affirm his belief that he was the stronger, faster, and more capable fighter. Instead, in a heartbeat, he had been effortlessly thrown, his pride shattered with a single, fluid move. His face flushed with embarrassment, but he quickly scrambled to his feet, his usual bravado now replaced with confusion. He looked around, unsure of how to respond, as the other students began to realize that what they had witnessed was no ordinary moment. Miss Evelyn remained standing calmly in the center of the mat, her posture unwavering. There was no taunt, no smug satisfaction in her expression, just a quiet, peaceful strength that seemed to fill the room. She had not raised her voice, had not even shown the slightest hint of aggression. All she had done was move with purpose, with precision, with quiet power. Her calm confidence had shattered the illusion that strength could only be measured by youth or appearance, that experience could be defined by age or physicality. The students stood in stunned silence, their earlier laughter replaced by a deep respect that began to settle over them like a heavy cloak. They had expected a spectacle, a display of power that would reinforce their own beliefs in their superiority. Instead, they had witnessed a profound lesson in humility. The power of calm confidence, of inner strength that doesn't need to be shouted or flaunted, had unfolded right in front of them. It was a moment of transformation not just for Ethan, who had learned a humbling lesson, but for every student in the room, who now understood that outer appearances and bravado meant nothing compared to the quiet strength that comes from within. Ethan, still recovering from the shock, nodded awkwardly, finally finding the humility to bow to Miss Evelyn in respect. The other students, one by one, followed suit, their earlier mockery replaced by admiration. Miss Evelyn offered them a soft smile, a gesture that spoke volumes more than words ever could, and with a final bow, she exited the mat, leaving behind a dojo full of students who would never forget the lesson they had learned. They had entered the dojo thinking they knew everything about strength and skill, but they had just witnessed the true power of calm confidence, a lesson that would stay with them long after the day was over. The dojo was alive with the sound of grunts, the shuffle of feet on mats, and the sharp, focused commands of the young instructor. It was a typical afternoon class, the students all eager to show off their latest techniques, and none more so than Jamal, a brash, overconfident teenager who had spent years honing his skills, believing himself to be the best among his peers. His lean muscles rippled with pride as he demonstrated his prowess, throwing jabs and punches, exuding a sense of superiority with every move. The other students watched him with awe, some mimicking his strikes, others quietly wishing they could one day match his skills. He knew it, too. Jamal was used to being the center of attention in the dojo, and he relished the respect it earned him. So, when the door to the dojo creaked open, and a woman walked in wearing a pink gi, the sight of her immediately drew puzzled looks. The old woman was nothing like the other students. She was in her late 60s, her hair graying and pulled back into a neat bun, her face lined with the wisdom of age. She didn't look like someone who belonged in a martial arts class. The snickers began almost immediately. The students whispered among themselves, eyeing the woman with disbelief. "What's she doing here?" one of them muttered, incredulous. "She's probably lost," another whispered, barely containing a laugh. But Jamal, eager to show off, stepped forward with a wide grin, the kind of grin that promised trouble. "Hey, Grandma," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You lost your way to the bingo hall? This place isn't for you. You're gonna break a hip or something." His laughter echoed through the dojo, and his friends joined in, their jeers laced with a cruelty that only the young and foolish could muster. The grandmother, unfazed by the ridicule, simply smiled and nodded. She didn't engage in the banter, nor did she show any signs of being rattled by the taunts. Instead, she walked slowly toward the center of the mat, her steps calm and measured, as though she had all the time in the world. The instructor, a young man in his early 20s, raised an eyebrow at her entrance but said nothing. After all, the dojo was a place for anyone who wanted to learn. Still, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Was this really the right place for someone like her? "Come on, Grandma," Jamal taunted again, stepping forward with exaggerated bravado. "You wanna try me, huh? I'll show you what real strength looks like." The students held their breath, wondering how far Jamal would take it, unsure if this was all just a joke or something more. But then, something unexpected happened. Without warning, the grandmother raised her arms and slowly began to loosen up, as if preparing for something much more than just a warm-up. Her movements were deliberate and precise, each one carrying a quiet confidence that caught everyone off guard. Jamal, still smirking, stepped into a fighting stance, convinced that this was going to be an easy match. He had no idea what he was up against. With a swift motion, the grandmother, who had been silent until now, moved toward Jamal with surprising speed. Jamal reacted too slowly. In an instant, she sidestepped his attempted grab, twisting her body in a way that looked effortless but was backed by years of experience. Before Jamal could process what had happened, she used his own momentum against him, sweeping his legs out from under him and sending him crashing onto the mat with a loud thud. The dojo fell silent. No one had expected it. Jamal, who was used to being the one throwing people around, now lay sprawled on the mat, his pride shattered. The students stared, wide-eyed, unsure of what to make of the situation. Jamal scrambled to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and anger, but there was no denying it. He had been outmatched, and the grandmother had done it with grace and ease. "You all right, kid?" the grandmother asked softly, her voice warm and patient, as if she had all the time in the world for him. "You're stronger than that. You just need to learn when to use your strength, and when to let go." Jamal stood there, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration. His usual bravado had vanished, replaced by a humbling realization. He had never encountered someone like this before, someone who didn't have to flaunt their strength, someone who could take the very thing he prided himself on and turn it into something entirely different. The room was still. The other students, who had watched the whole exchange, could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a young man being outclassed in a fight, it was about a lesson in humility, in understanding that strength wasn't just about physical power or bravado. It was about knowing when to stand firm, when to be patient, and when to recognize that true strength often comes from the most unlikely places. The grandmother didn't gloat or say anything further. She simply turned back toward the center of the mat, her eyes glancing over the young students who now stood in rapt attention. "Don't let your ego control you," she said quietly. "Your strength is only as valuable as your ability to respect others. True power is in knowing when not to fight, and when to fight with honor." Jamal, who had been too proud to listen to anyone before, now found himself listening closely, his previous arrogance replaced with a quiet sense of respect. He walked slowly toward the edge of the mat, his head lowered, as the other students gathered around the grandmother. No one made fun of her now. They had all witnessed something profound, something that made them rethink their entire approach to martial arts, and to life. As the grandmother slowly made her way to the corner of the dojo, the young students, including Jamal, stood in awe of the woman who had come into their world wearing a pink gi and left them with a lesson they would never forget. Strength wasn't about what you wore or how you looked. It wasn't about being the loudest or the strongest in the room. True strength came from within, from the quiet confidence that only experience and wisdom could cultivate. And sometimes, the most powerful warriors were the ones who never had to raise their voice to prove their worth. The dojo was buzzing with excitement as the young martial artists prepared for their afternoon training. The floor was lined with neatly arranged mats, the air filled with the sound of fists striking pads and the rhythmic shuffle of feet as sparring partners practiced their techniques. The students, mostly in their teens and early 20s, were in their element, showing off their skill, strength, and agility. Their instructor, Sensei Hiroshi, moved through the room, offering guidance and corrections with a watchful eye. Among the group, there was one student who stood out not for his skill, but for his attitude. Jake was a cocky, overconfident young man, known for his bravado both on and off the mat. He wore his arrogance like a badge of honor, belittling others to elevate himself. So when the dojo door creaked open and in walked a woman dressed in a bright pink gi, the students barely took notice at first. That is, until they saw her face, a weathered yet strong face with the kind of wisdom that could only come from a life lived fully. She was older than the others by decades, probably in her 60s, with graying hair tied neatly in a bun. The sight of her, a black grandma stepping onto the mat, stirred some quiet whispers and side glances. Her presence was an anomaly in this dojo full of young, strong fighters. Jake, who had been showing off to his friends just moments before, couldn't hold back a loud, mocking laugh. "What's this, Grandma? Here to show us some slow-motion moves," he sneered, eyeing the pink gi with amusement. "You sure you're in the right place? This is for fighters, not old ladies." The other students exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to react, but Jake's laugh filled the room with a smugness that seemed to demand attention. The grandma, however, didn't flinch. She simply smiled, her eyes twinkling with a calm confidence. She didn't speak, didn't challenge him, didn't even acknowledge his mockery. She just walked to the side of the mat and stood there, waiting. Sensei Hiroshi, who had been watching quietly, nodded toward Jake. "You're up next," he said, motioning toward the grandma. "You will spar with her." Jake's eyes widened at the instruction. "Wait, you want me to spar with her?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. "She's not even," but his words were cut short by the sensei's stern gaze. "Yes," Sensei Hiroshi said firmly, "you'll learn something today." Jake hesitated for a moment, his ego bruised by the idea of sparring with someone he saw as an easy target. But he didn't back down. "Fine. I'll make this quick," he muttered, stepping onto the mat with the cocky grin still plastered on his face. He cracked his knuckles, stretching his limbs like a fighter preparing for a big match, all the while clearly underestimating his opponent. The grandma stepped onto the mat, moving slowly, but with grace. Her pink gi fluttered slightly with each movement. She stood across from Jake, who was bouncing on the balls of his feet, eager to show off his strength and speed. The room grew quiet in anticipation, all eyes on the unlikely matchup. Ready? Sensei Hiroshi asked, his voice calm, but there was a quiet intensity in it. Jake nodded, still wearing a cocky smile. Ready to lose, Grandma. The moment Sensei Hiroshi called for the match to begin, Jake lunged forward with the speed and force of a trained fighter. He aimed for a quick strike, hoping to catch her off guard. But the grandma's reaction was swift, too swift for Jake to comprehend. In one fluid motion, she sidestepped his attack, her body moving with the precision of someone who had spent decades mastering the art of martial combat. Before Jake could even process what was happening, the grandma's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist, twisting it effortlessly. He stumbled, trying to regain his balance, but before he knew it, she had him in a tight hold, her grip unyielding. In one seamless motion, she threw him across the mat, sending him crashing onto the floor with a resounding thud. The room fell into stunned silence. Jake lay there for a moment, gasping for air, his mind struggling to catch up with the reality of what had just happened. His cocky grin had vanished, replaced by a look of disbelief and confusion. The students around the mat, once smirking and whispering, now stood frozen, wide-eyed at the sight of this petite woman effortlessly taking down the brash young fighter. Jake slowly picked himself up, his body sore and his pride bruised. He glared at the grandma, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. But there were no words, only the realization that he had made a grave mistake in underestimating her. The grandma, meanwhile, simply stood there, watching him with a kind but firm expression. She didn't speak, didn't gloat. She just stood quietly, her presence radiating a quiet strength that spoke volumes. Jake, now silent and humbled, bowed his head in respect. He didn't speak at first, but as he looked up at her, he finally managed to say, I didn't know. She nodded, her eyes softening. Strength isn't always about size or youth, young man. It's about discipline, control, and respect. And remember this: never underestimate anyone based on how they look. The words resonated through the room, and Jake felt the weight of them settle deep in his chest. For the first time in his life, his cockiness had been shattered, not by someone who outpowered him, but by someone who had earned her strength through years of experience, wisdom, and humility. The students, now with a newfound respect for the grandma, returned to their training, their focus shifted, their perceptions altered. Jake, standing there still in his fighting stance, realized that the greatest fighters weren't always the ones who looked the part, but those who understood that true strength comes not from appearances, but from inner control, respect, and experience. The grandma, with her pink GI, had taught them all a powerful lesson, one they would carry with